Hi, I'm Susan Cauley, and welcome to You're Not Alone, Surviving Your Child's Disability. What will happen when we are no longer able to care for our adult child with a disability is a question parents often ask themselves. Here to discuss this issue of future planning is Lee Rachel German, Lead Disability Advocate for Personal Disability Consulting. Hi, how are you today?
I'm fine. Glad to be here.
Good. When should parents start planning for their adult child with a disability?
You know, I think it's never too soon to start. If a child is going to be involved with developmental disability services, then the official planning and transition time starts at age 14. Age 18 is another really critical age because that's when you want to be thinking about guardianship and benefits and turning 22. So 14 is really a good place to start because if your child needs to be on any waiting lists, public sector services, that's when you want to start. You want to have a pretty good idea before your child turns 18 about what adult public sector services you're going into and what public benefits you're going to be looking at.
Boy, I'm way behind. How does all of this happen? I mean, how do we start planning?
Well, hopefully whatever school system your child is in has people who are well informed. You want to be involved in whatever disability-specific organization your child has. The Federation for Children with Special Needs has transition planning trainings for parents. There are private case managers who work with transition planning, all of the above.
Oh, great. So why should parents establish a team in order to plan and care for their adult child with a disability?
What I find, and it's probably not so different from your experience, is that lots of times it's the parents, and maybe often, not to be stereotypical, but the mom who's carrying 90% or 95% of the case management for their child with a disability. When those adult children get into the late teens and the late 20s, the last person they want managing them is their mom.
Right.
And they want some separation because that's a normal development, but also it's a lot for one person to do alone. So you want to plan so that if the parent burns out, is no longer able, has your own health issues, that you've got other people to support your child.
And that could happen basically at any time.
Anytime.
So that's more scary than I think anything, is not knowing when that plan is going to go into effect.
And if you're divorced and you're really the only person carrying your child and the rest of your kids, then it's even scarier. If you don't have siblings or parents or adult children who are interested in providing that support, then lots of people are kind of going, I don't have anybody.
Right.
And then you really have to be deliberate about who can be on my team.
Yeah, I mean, that scares me because I don't have family. And I only have one daughter who's fine, and I don't think she wants the burden of having the whole thing, taken care of them. And so I don't really know what to do outside of hiring professionals. Is that what you have to do?
I think you look at both your unpaid and paid, and your professional and other people. So I know people who the main support is clergy. There's a clergy person who's been really close to. I've got a client who his main support is his local clergy. His stepmom is somebody who's paid for services for him. He doesn't think of her at all. She doesn't live locally. He doesn't think of her as a support person. But it could be a neighbor. It could be somebody who feels like a cousin or an aunt, but isn't a blood relative.
Right.
But you feel that relationship. I've seen people like that in my own family where, this is my cousin, this is my aunt and uncle, but they're not.
Yeah,
or not genetically,
Right.
And so you think about who are the blood relations? Is there anybody who's willing to carry it on? And we all have different criteria about how much is enough and how much is too much.
Right.
So you may have a sibling who lives in California who's willing to do some money management. You may have somebody local who's willing to see his brother once a year but manage a trust. You may have a former school teacher, a former aide, somebody who worked at the nonprofit day program that your kid was in, who loves your child and has a wonderful relationship, that person may be willing to be part of a team.
Now, do all of these people, do they have specific roles, or should they have specific roles?
That's a really good question. I think you can think about it as a tight team and teams with different functions, or people with different functions, because if you're going to need a legal person, then you want somebody who knows disability law and supplemental needs trusts. You might need a financial planner, depending on whether you have assets or not. You might want to hire somebody like me to be kind of a team leader or a case manager.
Right.
So you need to look at the health insurance piece. Do you need somebody who can deal with your doctors, or do you not? I mean, I had a client who was really badly injured, and what they really needed was a nurse to case manage all his in-home care. That's very different from saying, I need somebody to help me with what health insurance should I be on? Should I be getting disability benefits from
Right.
Social Security? Are there assets? Do we need some kind of trust? And then who are the people? And so those people, maybe your attorney, you're going to have contact with once initially to set up a trust, and then not a whole lot going forward unless you have questions. But who are the people who are going to be the decision makers in an ongoing way about what does your adult child, you're becoming an adult child, want? What are you looking for in the way of services? Who's monitoring? So that can be a smaller group of trusted people. And it should include, as much as possible, the person with a disability.
Okay. Well, that was my next question. How much should this person with a disability have a say in what happens to them?
I think we've really moved. It used to be your child's turning 18, you need to become a guardian.
Right.
Now the movement is, can your child make informed decisions? Can your child listen and accept input? So it's not a legal process yet, but it's called supported decision making, where somebody who's got a certain amount of independence says, you know what, I want my mother, I want this staff person, maybe I want my aunt or my financial planner to be my immediate team, and they're going to help me when I have these kinds of decisions. And maybe we're going to meet on a regular basis, or maybe I'm going to call you, Mom, when I have this kind of question.
Right.
So that's it's legally still kind of in its pilot stages, but it really is moving around the person with the disability to say, we want to support you to make informed decisions. You have the right. People have the right to make bad decisions.
Right.
It's a little different in the disability world because
Right.
those rights tend to get taken away. So yes, guardianship is important if you have somebody who can't communicate, can't make an informed decision, really needs to be protected. But on the other hand, we've got a whole spectrum of people who, can you make an informed decision even if it's explained pretty simply, and keep it simple, and people can.
Yeah, do you think with the person who's like nonverbal and not able to communicate with the team that they should have maybe a picture book or something that would help
Yes.
them be able to, at least give some idea as to what they want?
There's something called person-centered planning, where it really is about sitting down with the family, the key players, person with a disability. Somebody was telling me recently that her son, I think is a teenager now and is nonverbal, I think on the spectrum.
Yep.
And using pictures, he was able to basically to express that he wants to live on a farm. And
Well, that's good, though.
That was huge. It was
is
a huge
huge.
piece of information because we make assumptions. When I work with people with disabilities, especially if there's physical limitations and they're not driving and they're not independent, then I talk about living in an urban area where you can get down the street to the coffee shop or to the post office or to the supermarket or to public transportation.
Right.
So for this young man to be saying, I want to be in the country, I want to be with animals, I want this, that's a
Right.
pretty important thing. And that was done non-verbally and with pictures and picture books.
Wow. I mean, how would you be able to get him to really live on a farm? I mean, that would be something that would be pretty difficult, I would
There are
think.
programs. There are some programs. There are some farm community programs that tend to be small. you know,
That's
that
interesting.
that are out there, and some are very well run. So it's an interesting, you know, how do you figure it out? Well, what do you know about your child? You know, he loves this color. He hates that. He hates being in crowds.
Right.
He loves being outside. I have a client who loves being outside. You know, I have another client who likes being useful. She's got a lot of behaviors that get in her way, but she likes changing the trash can. Well, can that get, and she wants to work. So you start with, okay, this kind of skill, and she wants to work. So what are the things that she
Right.
can do?
Right. I'm laughing because I have a nonverbal daughter who's autistic, and she loves to change the trash can. And I'm like, why? But I don't know. Anyway, they're funny.
It's a concrete success.
Yeah. Well, definitely. What else do you think a person with a disability might want besides, you know, who is going to take care of them?
You know, I think people with disabilities are like everybody else. I hear a lot of young adults saying, I want to get married, I want a boyfriend, I want a girlfriend.
Right.
Sometimes that's not realistic because they don't have a peer group, or I have a client who's actually been with his girlfriend for years. He's early 20s, met her in a residential school program. I don't even know that they're sexual. They consider themselves boyfriend and girlfriend. They're going to get a 2-bedroom apartment with supports.
Wow.
And he relates better to her than anybody else. Will they ever be sexual? I have no idea. And but as long as they have the supports around that,
Right.
then great. So you know, I certainly have seen people who have no capacity for sexual relationships and want them, and it's a big fantasy and it's a big source of sadness in their lives. And I've seen other people who've been very successful in going for relationships. So I think people with disabilities want what everybody else wants. They want to be
Right.
close. Most people, I have some clients who are really reclusive, and they're really happy being reclusive. They like being left alone.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's like everybody else in the world. There's a range of
There definitely is a range.
who
I
we
can
are
tell.
and what we want and how we live.
Could you tell me a little bit about the letter of direction and what that means and what it should be, what should be in that letter?
I know it is mostly, I tend to refer to it as a letter of intent. And I really like what Shepherd Financial does with it, because the first couple of pages of their letter of intent is really vision. What do I envision my child's life to look like? What do I envision a guardianship's role or a trustee's role? What do I envision a living situation for my loved one? And then it talks about a lot of specifics. Who is my son or my daughter? What do they like to do? How are they social? Do they go to church? What church? So that it's a combination of vision and let me record what's important to know. And that includes health, that includes personal, that includes social, that includes likes and dislikes. I had somebody bring me what was more a letter of declaration that, for her son that was very specific. It was, I want him to be living in a condo where he will have XYZ staff, and I'll have another condo for that, and I will hire the staff to do this and that. And it was like, this is a little rigid, and there may be programs that already exist that can do this in a
Right.
more cost-effective way, or you know. And she was really like, no, I am going to provide this. And I felt like that was so narrow that if somebody really took her to the letter of her declaration, there would be no room for movement for this is what she thought he needed, but is that what he really needed?
Right. I mean, I was
So-
going to say, is that something that he expressed, or is it just
That was hers. That was her, I think this is
Just
what he
hers.
needs. So that's back to how much input does the person with a disability have? When is that person realistic or not? I certainly see people who know what's going on, know their strengths and weaknesses. And like anybody else, I see people with disabilities who are in complete denial about what's going on. They don't acknowledge the label, or they don't acknowledge. I've got a lady I'm working with now who's 59. She's got a decline. She can't move as well. She's not as independent. We're really at the place of maybe the living situation you're in right now isn't working. She doesn't want to go to a group home.
right?
She'd like to take a vacation in Greece. Her guardians say that's never going to happen, certainly
Right.
not independently. And her service coordinator every year brings it up as something that's a goal, and her guardians tear out their hair. I
Right.
don't know. I mean, maybe she could go to Greece with alternative leisures if they ever had a tour to, you know, to go on a supervised trip for people with disabilities to
Right.
Greece. She could do that.
Right.
I don't know that there's money for it. I certainly hear that her guardians don't think she can do it and that she'd like to do it. So I think it's all about, you know, what are your goals and what's realistic
Right.
and how do you strive for the highest?
Yeah, I mean, that's hard. I don't. So, what is the letter of direction or letter of intent? What should it actually have?
I think it
in
should have a lot of, this is who my relative is, this kind of church, this is the medication, here's the providers, my medical providers, here's key people in his life, and here's what I'm visioning. Here's what I vision, and here's what he's expressed to me about his vision. And I don't think it would be a bad thing to have a section in there that here's his vision,
Right.
here's what he says. And it may or may not be the same, but I think it's really important for whoever's working with a person with a disability to hear, this is what my guardians are saying, this is what the person with a disability is saying, this is what outside people. So the lady that I'm working with right now, one of her guardians feels adamantly that she should never be on medication, on antidepressants.
Right.
And other people feel like she's depressed. There's a lot of transition and change going on, and a little bit of antidepressants might be a really helpful thing for her.
Right.
The guardian doesn't want to hear it. One guardian, there are two guardians, so the other one is
Right.
backed off. So it's like, I don't know what's in this client's best interest, but the guardian is like, ain't going to happen.
Yeah, but unfortunately, I'm sure that's going to happen. But are they thinking about his best interests or her best interests?
Yeah, I think they're thinking. They're thinking really hard about what's in her best interest, but we all look through our own lens. So a letter of intent is still coming from the parents' lens and view, and but that's where I think you want to say, this is what I want. I want my kid to be as independent as possible, or maybe I want my kid to be as safe as possible. Maybe safety is the most important thing for me.
Right.
I don't care about my kid being independent. I don't want risk taking. I want safety. I want medical safety. I don't want to worry about, is my daughter vulnerable, or is my son vulnerable because anybody's going to be able to get him to give him money if they say, hey, I need $1.
Right, right.
That kind of social vulnerability that so many of our family members have.
Right.
So there's a line here of what's my vision and
Yeah, and what their vision is.
Right, and so I think if you think of it as guidance and here's what you need to know when I'm not here, here's what's important to know, then I think that's really helpful.
Now, why plan for a family meeting to discuss the future of a child with a disability?
Because family dynamics are like the elephant in the living room. It's, no matter how many siblings you have or how many aunts and uncles you have or don't have, the reality is that everybody's idea about how much I'm willing to put in this relationship is different. And there really needs to be a lot of respect about that. So I think a family meeting family meetings have a whole bunch of tiers. The first is to share information. People don't understand public benefits. They don't understand Social Security. They don't understand the difference between Medicare and Medicaid. So the first is kind of share some basic information. Hey, this is where our brother lives and is in a day program. These are the agencies that are involved. These are the benefits he gets.
Right.
This is what I've been doing. This is who he is. And moving forward, let's talk about if and how those of us here are willing to be involved. So I have a client whose brother manages the finances. He doesn't even see him once a year, maybe once a year. And it's, the other side of Boston, basically. I don't think he's ever liked him. So something I say to family members is you have to respect your own boundaries. If you have never liked this mentally ill brother, it's always been tough, you've resented that he got all the attention, there's only so much you may want to do for him.
Right.
Or with him.
Right.
So I have one client Her brother owns the condo she lives in. It used to be the mother's. He's out of state. One of her sisters, her youngest sister, is her guardian. And another sister, I didn't even know lived locally.
Wow.
Because she never sees her. And she's got 2 daughters who basically see her very little. So you have to respect that one person's idea of being there for her mother is to see her twice a week, take her to all the doctor's appointments and do her medication. Somebody else's idea of taking care of her mother or her brother or her son is managing the money and never seeing him. Somebody else's idea of it, or paying somebody to do stuff.
Right.
And somebody else's idea is, I'll call him once a month. And so you can't be judgmental. I mean, people get really angry and resentful at the relative who, whether it's taking care of a parent or taking care of a sibling especially, I'm doing more than you are. I really resent that you're not doing more. And it's like, you know what? We all have
That's
different
all that they can
different
give.
boundaries, so you have to agree to be respectful. Maybe you're raising a family and starting a business, and maybe I'm retiring, or maybe I'm just divorced, or whatever. But we all have different expectations and boundaries. So we need to share that, and we need to then talk about, well, okay, which of us are willing to do what without pressure, without guilt. Who's willing to do what, and is that enough? And who's willing to be the keeper of the information? Who's willing to be the team leader? Is there anybody in the family who's willing and able to do that? And if not, then you look at your finances and go, do we hire somebody?
Right.
Or is there somebody in the public sector system that my loved one is involved in who can case manage, and given the limitations of public sector life, can they do it sufficiently?
Now, can a case say a case manager or the decision maker, do they have to become a guardian?
No way. No.
They don't have to?
I'm not a guardian for any of my clients. I actually have one client now that I've worked with for more than 10 years, whose parents are co-guardians, and both of them are out of the country most of the year. Her mom has Alzheimer's now, and her sister is out of the country, and her brother is here. He's got a young family, he's got a new business, and he's taking care of the mom with Alzheimer's. So she's the only client that I'm going to co-guardian with. But for the most part, guardians and trustees can hire somebody like me to take the load off of them.
Right.
And to help coordinate.
What is the purpose of having a special needs attorney?
Some of the public sector benefits are based on being poor. So if your relative has worked and paid into Social Security and has been able to work and earn a certain amount of money and pay into Social Security and FICA, that's the same pot of money that we get Social Security retirement from. If you then become too disabled to work, and you've worked long enough and recently enough, you're getting money out of that pot of money. It's not, but it's considered that way. You've basically earned it. And that has nothing to do with assets or income. So that one's not so critical. But the other one, called SSI, or Supplemental Security Income, says you must be disabled and poor, meaning no more than $2,000 in assets in your name.
Yeah,
so
that's
you don't want your
ridiculous.
grandmother to leave you $100,000. You because it will make you ineligible for it. And Medicaid in Massachusetts is Mass Health also looks at income levels. So if you want to maximize your eligibility for those things, it behooves you to have any inheritance money or money from parents put into what's called a supplemental or a special needs trust.
I was going to ask you about
and
that.
if you somehow, so I have a client who was in a car accident that resulted in a brain injury. Actually, I have several, and they get monthly annuities as part of the insurance settlement. If that goes into a supplemental needs trust, then that's not countable income.
I see.
For that client that makes him ineligible for some of these benefits. Housing is the same thing. Public sector housing looks at your income. So the laws on these things can move and change, but a supplemental needs trust is a way to, A, require that money to be used for the disabled person's benefit, and B, makes you more likely to be eligible for these public sector benefits.
Okay.
So it's critical.
But what, with the special needs trust, is there an amount that you can have in that, or is that limitless?
Well, it's limitless. It can be a lot of money, and if you don't have a lot of money, if somebody's leaving you $20,000, that's when you consider putting it into what's called a pooled trust, so in Massachusetts we have, I'm going to get the name wrong, it used to be, I think it's Plan of Massachusetts in Rhode Island, where people who don't have a lot of money to save or to do a trust put it into this trust. The money gets pooled together and I believe invested all, but it's got a Medicaid payback provision.
I see.
So if you don't have a large quantity of assets, that's the most cost-effective way to go. And then there's something called the ABLE Act now, which says that if the person with a disability is determined disabled by Social Security, I believe before age 26, that you can have a certain amount in assets in what's called an ABLE account, which is an investment account, and it's in the disabled person's name. I think you can have $14,000 a year go into it. Don't hold me on the dollar amount, with a maximum up to $100,000. And SSI and Medicaid do not look at it as an asset. So I've got a client who's working. He wants to be able to save money. He can put a certain amount into that, and it will not penalize him.
Anything. The last question is, why should, what is the longest period that you can have for doing this? And in other words, what I'm getting at is that how often do you have to revise this?
When you're thinking about planning with family?
When you're planning with family or with the whole process?
Well, I think there's a point where you sit down and you make a big plan, which is really, I think what we're talking about today at least is envisioning transition to adulthood. And do I see my child going into public sector services? Do I see him living in a group home? Do I see him living independently with supports? Do I want to build an addition on my house and have him live there? And so all of that is kind of the where am I going? What's the direction? Then I think there's a point of, well, we're really doing this. Right. We're involved with developmental disability services. We're involved with Department of Mental Health. And they all have annual meetings. And I don't think it's unreasonable to have an annual family meeting or an annual, let's revisit how things have changed.
Right, because I'm sure that people have different viewpoints after a couple of years, or some things change when one person is disabled now, or something like that. I'm sure that's plays into it.
With people with developmental disabilities, the maturing process takes longer. So you hear about my 18-year-old functions like a 5-year-old or a 12-year-old, and then I hear about somebody who's 30, and guess what? He's got a job now, and he's working 9 to 5, and he couldn't get up for classes.
Right,
he got thrown out of college. So
yep.
I think the reality is that people change and grow or get worse depending on health issues, and it's really important that if there's a critical change, you make a point of having a team meeting and revisiting. But if things are going pretty well, then an annual meeting is a reasonable thing to say, how are things going? Do we need to change anything?
Right.
Or is it really working well?
Well, I thank you very much for coming and speaking to us on future planning, because it's very important. Establishing a team for the future care of your adult child with a disability should become a priority, especially as you advance in years. You will feel more at ease knowing there is a plan in place for your loved one. Join us again next time on You're Not Alone, Surviving a Child's Disability.